There is a red shield hanging above a doorway in Frankfurt, Germany, in the year 1744, a small sign, painted iron, weathered at the edges, fixed to the front of a narrow house on a street, so overcrowded it barely qualifies as a street. The Judengasse, the Jews' alley, is a lane sealed at both ends by gates, locked each night, and on Christian holidays. The people who live here are not permitted to own land outside this corridor. They are not permitted to hire Christian servants. They cannot walk freely through most of the city around them. The gates determine when they sleep and when they wake. And above one of the doors in this sealed corridor, a red shield hangs. The man who lives under that shield is named Moses Amschel Bauer. He is a money changer. He lends coins and currency at interest, tracks debt, manages exchange rates between the currencies of a dozen different German states, and keeps meticulous records in a ledger that almost no one outside this alley will ever see. When Moses dies, his son inherits the trade. His son's name is Mayer Amschel Bauer. Mayer is born in the same year as that shield, 1744. He grows up beneath it. He learns to read prices before he learns to read books. He memorizes the value of coins the way other children memorize prayers. He apprentices with a banking house in Hanover called Oppenheimer. And when he returns to Frankfurt, he is no longer simply the son of a money changer. He is a man who understands how money moves between powerful people. And more importantly, he understands that the men who move it are far more powerful than the men who spend it. At some point in his adult life, Mayer Amschel Bauer makes a decision. He stops using the name Bauer. He begins calling his family Rothschild. The word comes directly from what hung above his father's door, Rothschild, red shield, the German words folded into a single surname. The shield becomes the name becomes a dynasty, and the dynasty becomes something that has no clean word for it. Not a family, not a bank, not a government, but a structure that touches all three simultaneously in 5 cities across 5 generations, and eventually across 2 centuries and counting. Most people who know the name Rothschild know roughly this version of the story. A clever man in a Frankfurt ghetto who turned a red sign into an empire. It is the story the family itself has told through official biographies and commissioned histories. And because it is largely true in its surface facts, it tends to end the inquiry before the harder questions begin. The harder questions are these: where did the Bauer family come from before Frankfurt? Why did a family of modest money changers possess knowledge of pan-European financial networks that should have been entirely outside their social reach? What was the origin of the financial methodology that Mayer Amschel would later deploy with such precision? The simultaneous multi-city lending model, the use of family members as nodes in a distributed network, the practice of financing multiple sides of a conflict to guarantee returns regardless of outcome. These are not the practices of a man who invented them from scratch in a locked alley in Frankfurt. These are the practices of a tradition. The question is, what tradition? To answer that, you have to go east, very far east, and you have to go back much further than 1744. There is a civilization that does not appear in the standard Western history curriculum. You will not find a single chapter dedicated to it in most university textbooks published in the 20th century. Its name appears on maps, hundreds of maps drawn by cartographers across Europe from the 14th century through the 18th. And then, in a span of decades, the name begins to vanish. The civilization is called Tartaria, and the territory it describes at its maximum extent covers most of the Eurasian landmass. When European cartographers in the 1005 Hundreds drew the world as they understood it. They labeled the vast interior of Asia with the word Tartaria. This was not a vague placeholder, the way older maps sometimes wrote phrases like "here be dragons" in regions they had not explored. The maps that feature Tartaria are detailed. They show rivers and cities and administrative divisions. They show trade roads. The 1570 Atlas of Abraham Ortelius, one of the most respected cartographers of the early modern period, contains a dedicated map of Tartaria that shows it divided into distinct regions: Tartaria Magna, Tartaria Chinensis, and Tartaria Moscovitica among them. The cartographers of the 17th century, Blieu, Hondius, Janssen, all produce maps in which Tartaria occupies the central and eastern portions of Eurasia as a recognizable political and geographic entity, and then the maps change. By the mid-19th century, Tartaria as a geographic label begins to disappear from European cartography. The territory is divided up and absorbed into the expanding borders of Russia and China. The name is relegated to historical footnote, then curiosity, then obscurity. In academic circles, the surviving references are explained away as a loose European term for the Mongol and Turkic peoples of the steppe, a catch-all designation with no coherent political meaning. This explanation has been accepted without much scrutiny for 150 years, but there is a problem with that explanation. The people who drew those maps were not careless men. Ortelius corresponded with scholars across Europe and the Mediterranean. Blieu held the position of official cartographer to the Dutch East India Company, the most commercially powerful organization of the 17th century. These men produced their maps using information from merchants, travelers, diplomats, and intelligence networks. When Blieu drew the borders of Tartaria and indicated cities within them, he was not guessing. He was recording what his sources told him existed. The revisionist position, and it is a position that sits well outside mainstream academic history, which is a fact worth holding in mind without letting it settle the question, is that Tartaria was not simply a geographic label applied to nomadic peoples. It was a functioning civilization with an administrative structure, a trade network, and an economic system that predated the rise of the Western European nation states and operated in parallel with them for centuries. The Silk Road, which connected China, Persia, and the Indian subcontinent to the Mediterranean world, ran through Tartarian territory. The financial infrastructure that kept that road operational, the letters of credit, the currency exchange systems, the trusted merchant networks that stretched from Samarkand to Genoa, was not a spontaneous creation, it was an inheritance. Here is what the standard history tells you about the Silk Road's financial architecture. It will say that the system of letters of credit, the letter 1, E2, 5, a WALA, the Softaja, the bill of exchange emerged independently in different regions and gradually converged as trade expanded. It will say that the great banking houses of medieval Italy, the Medici, the Bardi, and the Peruzzi, invented European commercial banking in the 13th and 14th centuries from first principles. What the standard history is less interested in examining is where the knowledge came from. The Medici did not emerge in a vacuum. Florence was a city whose wealth depended on trade routes, and the trade routes ran east. The agents of Florentine banking houses operated in Constantinople, Alexandria, Beirut, and the Black Sea ports that connected the Mediterranean to the Caspian and beyond. The financial instruments they used, the bill of exchange, the letter of credit, the practice of managing multiple accounts in multiple currencies simultaneously, bear a structural resemblance to systems already operational in the Eastern trade networks they were plugging into. The Mongol Empire is a piece of this that rarely receives adequate attention in Western economic history. At its peak in the 13th century, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. It stretched from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to Persia, and one of its most consequential administrative decisions was the establishment of what might be called the first pancontinental postal and financial relay system. The YAM, the Mongol courier network, connected the empire's extremities with a speed of communication that would not be matched in Europe for another 4 centuries. Merchants operating under Mongol protection could move goods and financial instruments across 8,000 miles of territory under a single legal framework. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, was not just a military phenomenon. It was a commercial one. It created conditions under which the financial networks of the East could expand and formalize in ways that had not previously been possible. When the Mongol Empire fractured in the 14th century, those networks did not simply evaporate. They contracted, and they adapted, and they moved. The merchant families who had operated within the Mongol commercial framework dispersed westward along the existing trade corridors, carrying their financial knowledge with them. Some of them settled in the cities of the Crimea and the Caucasus. Some moved further west into the territories of what would become Poland, Lithuania, and the Rhineland. Among them were Ashkenazi Jewish merchant families who occupied a particular commercial niche within the Mongol trade system, permitted to conduct financial operations that were restricted to Muslim and Christian merchants under their respective religious laws. They had functioned as financial intermediaries across the steppe for generations. The Bauer family of Frankfurt does not appear in comprehensive genealogical records before the 17th century. This is not unusual for families of the Judengasse. The record keeping for the Jewish community of Frankfurt was intermittent, and many records were destroyed or lost. What is known is that by the time Moses Amschel Bauer is practicing as a money changer in the early 18th century, he is operating within a tradition of financial practice that has deep roots in exactly the Eastern commercial networks described above. The word Bauer in German means farmer or peasant. It is a surname that is not obviously connected to financial practice. It is the kind of name that a family might adopt, or that might be assigned to them by civic authorities, as a simple occupational or residential designation that tells very little about the actual origin of the people who carry it. This is worth dwelling on. In the early modern period, surnames were not stable. Jewish families in German-speaking territories frequently operated under multiple names: a Hebrew religious name, a Yiddish family name, and a German civic name that satisfied the requirements of local authorities. The name recorded in a Frankfurt tax register or a guild document was not necessarily the name the family used among themselves or the name that connected them to their actual genealogical history. When Mayor Amschel Bauer renamed his family Rothschild, he was not creating a dynasty name from nothing. He was selecting from the available symbolic material, the red shield that already had meaning within the family's commercial identity, and using it to create a name that would function in European commercial world while retaining a connection to that identity. The red shield itself is interesting. In Ashkenazi Jewish tradition, the shield of David, the Star of David, the hexagram is one of the oldest and most widely recognized symbols. The Rothschild family crest, when it was formally established, incorporated this symbol alongside a fist clutching 5 arrows, one for each of Mayor Amschel's 5 sons. The arrows are often cited as a reference to the family's expansion strategy, one son sent to each of the 5 major financial centers of Europe. But the shield as a symbol predates Mayer's use of it. The red shield hanging above the door was placed there by his father, and possibly by whoever came before his father. The symbol, in other words, has a history that the standard biography does not fully pursue. In the esoteric and revisionist literature, and here it is worth being explicit that we are moving into territory where the evidence becomes speculative and the claims become more contested, there are researchers who have pointed to the red shield as a symbol with pre-Ashkenazi origins, connected to older Eastern mystery traditions and merchant guilds that operated along the Silk Road. The hexagram appears in the religious art of multiple Eastern traditions, including Hindu and Buddhist iconography, and its use as a protective or identifying symbol for traveling merchant families is documented in several contexts that predate its association specifically with Ashkenazi Judaism. The argument these researchers make is that the symbol itself is a trace of an older affiliation, that the family carrying it was connected to trading networks and possibly esoteric organizations that operated across the Tartarian trade territory long before they settled in Frankfurt. This argument cannot be proven from the surviving documentary record. That is an honest statement, but the absence of proof is not the same as disproof, and the fact that the documentary record is thin does not mean the question is illegitimate. The historical record for the pre-Frankfurt period of many major European banking families is similarly thin, and this is not an accident. Financial networks operating across political and religious boundaries in the pre-modern period had structural incentives to maintain opacity. Discretion was a survival mechanism. The families that lasted were the ones that did not make their full operations legible to any single authority. What can be said with more confidence is this: by the time Mayer Amschel Rothschild, formerly Bauer, is operating in Frankfurt in the second half of the 18th century, he is deploying a financial methodology that is a system with identifiable components. The first is the multinodal family network, 5 sons, 5 cities, all operating under a unified strategy with coordinated intelligence. Nathan in London, Jacob in Paris, Salomon in Vienna, Amschel in Frankfurt, Common in Naples. This is not a model Mayer invented. It is a network model requiring prior understanding of how network-based financial operations function across political boundaries. The second component is the intelligence advantage. The Rothschild network was faster than governments. The most cited instance is Waterloo in 1815. Nathan Rothschild received confirmation of Napoleon's defeat before the British government did, through the family's private courier network. What he did with that information is disputed, but the structural fact it illustrates is not. The family maintained a private intelligence and communication network faster and more reliable than the official communications of European nation-states. This capability does not emerge from one generation of thinking. It is inherited infrastructure. The third component is the financing of conflict. Mayer Amschel Rothschild's foundational client relationship was with Wilhelm I, 9th Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel, one of the wealthiest rulers in Germany. Wilhelm's primary source of income was the rental of Hessian soldiers to foreign powers, most famously to the British during the American Revolutionary War. Mayer managed Wilhelm's money, and in doing so he gained access to the financial flows connected to international military contracting. When Mayer died in 1812, he left his sons a formula: lend to governments at war, collect with interest when the war ends, and maintain relationships with all sides so that the winning side is always. In your debt, this formula is often attributed to Mayer as a personal innovation, but it is in its structural logic identical to the financing model that the great merchant banking houses of the Eastern trade networks had used to manage relations between the competing Mongol successor states after the empire's fragmentation. You do not invent this formula, you inherit it. This brings us back to the question that the standard biography of the Rothschilds does not ask. The official narrative begins in 1744 with Mayer's birth in the Judengasse. It acknowledges his father Moses and the money changers' trade. It does not ask where Moses's knowledge came from, or where his father's knowledge came from, or how far back the lineage of financial practice actually extends. It treats the Frankfurt Judengasse as the origin point of the story, when it is more accurately a middle chapter. The revisionist economic historians who have approached this subject with more methodological rigor, and here the work of scholars like Carroll Quigley, whose 1966 book, Tragedy and Hope, examined the interlocking financial networks of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and Anthony Sutton, whose research into Wall Street's financing of both the Bolshevik Revolution and the rise of fascism challenged the standard Cold War narrative point to something structural that the mainstream account tends to minimize. The great banking dynasties of the modern era did not rise to prominence purely through individual genius and favorable circumstance. They rose through network relationships that preceded them, through accumulated institutional knowledge that does not appear in any single family's biography, and through access to communication and intelligence infrastructure that only makes sense if it was inherited rather than built. Quigley's central finding that there exists in modern financial history a layer of coordination and intention that the public record does not show is precisely the kind of structural observation that the revisionist economic history approach to the Rothschild story is trying to recover. The Rothschild family's own organizational model is a specific instance of the pattern Quigley identifies at the macro level. The five-city network that Mayer established was explicitly designed to prevent any single government from having full visibility into the family's operations. When Nathan was in London and Jacob was in Paris, and the two countries were at war with each other, both governments needed the Rothschilds' financial services too badly to move against them. The network's geographic distribution was a structural defense, and the family's deliberate avoidance of public record. They maintained correspondence in a private cipher, used code names in financial communications, and destroyed or withheld large portions of their archive from researchers was consistent with the operational security of a network that understood from long experience that legibility to any single authority was a liability. This is where the Tartarian connection acquires its most interesting dimension for the revisionist economic historian. Tartaria as a political entity was characterized by precisely this kind of distributed, resilient structure. The Mongol administrative model was not centralized in the way that Roman or Chinese imperial administration was centralized. Authority was distributed across a network of regional commanders and administrators who operated with significant autonomy under a shared legal and commercial framework. This distribution made the empire more resilient to internal shocks than centralized empires. When one node failed, the others continued to function. When the empire itself eventually fragmented, the administrative nodes did not simply cease to exist. They became the basis of the successor states, the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, and the commercial networks that had operated within the unified empire continued to operate across the boundaries of its successors, because the merchants and financiers who ran those networks had relationships that preceded the political boundaries. A family that had operated as financial intermediaries within this structure for generations would carry in their operational practice a model of distributed network management that would look from the outside like extraordinary genius when it was actually the application of inherited institutional logic to a new geography. When Mayor Amschel Rothschild dispatched his 5 sons to 5 European cities, he was not inventing a new business model. He was applying an old one. The specific question of the Bauer name and why it was used and why it was then discarded opens into this analysis in a way that is easy to overlook. The surname Bauer, meaning farmer or peasant, is one of the most common German surnames. It carries no distinguishing information. For a family whose operational security depended on maintaining a degree of invisibility to the civic authorities around them, a surname that is essentially a blank, that says nothing about origin, trade, lineage, or affiliation, would be a practical choice. It is the kind of name that disappears into the population. And when Mayer renamed the family Rothschild, he chose a name that was locally specific, rooted in the physical object above the door of a house in a particular Frankfurt street, rather than genealogically revealing. The new name was a public brand, the old name was a veil, and what lay beneath the veil, in terms of actual origin and lineage, was neither the new brand nor the veil. There are researchers who have pushed this further, claiming that the Bauer family's Eastern origins connect them directly to the Khazar ruling elite, the Turkic kingdom of the Caspian steppe that converted to Judaism in the 8th or 9th century. The Khazar hypothesis in its historical form is a legitimate inquiry into genuinely uncertain questions about population, genetics, and migration. In its extreme revisionist form, it provides no useful evidence and generates more heat than light. The documentary record does not support resolving it in either direction. What can be established without resolving that question is that the Eastern steppe and the trade networks of the Tartarian territory were the origin environment for the financial practices that eventually appeared in Frankfurt. What the evidence does support is a picture of European financial history that is more continuous with Eastern commercial history than the standard narrative suggests, and a picture of the Rothschild dynasty that is more accurately described as the visible apex of a very old and very deep network than as the spontaneous creation of one clever man in a Frankfurt ghetto. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 is the clearest single illustration of what the Rothschild network had become by the generation after Mayer's founding. The Congress was convened to redraw the map of Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. It was attended by the representatives of every major European power. The decisions made there would shape the continent's political structure for the next century, and the Rothschild family financed it. More precisely, the Rothschild family managed the debt obligations of multiple sovereign states simultaneously, and their 5 city network served as the financial clearinghouse through which diplomatic settlement was monetized. No single government at Vienna could implement its territorial arrangements without access to credit markets. The family that controlled those credit markets was therefore present at the negotiating table in a way that left no official record, because it did not need to. The influence was structural. It operated through the mechanism of debt, rather than through the mechanism of direct political participation. This is the model that persists through the 19th century and into the 20th. The financing of the Suez Canal, the financing of the De Beers diamond monopoly, the involvement in the creation of the Federal Reserve System in the United States, documented through the participation of Paul Warburg, a German-born banker connected to the Hamburg-Warburg House, which maintained a working relationship with the Rothschild network since the Napoleonic era. The standard historical account acknowledges these individual connections without reading them as a continuous pattern extending backward to a model of financial organization structurally older than any single dynasty that carries it. The Tartaria question has been revived in recent years primarily through alternative history researchers, YouTube documentaries, independent publications, and communities organized around the mud flood hypothesis, which is a theory that a cataclysmic event in the relatively recent past buried evidence of a more advanced prior civilization. The specific claims of the mud flood hypothesis are not well supported by geological or archaeological evidence, but the impulse driving it, the sense that the historical record is incomplete, that something significant has been edited out of the public account, is an impulse responding to genuine gaps, even if the specific mechanism proposed does not hold. The gap in the account of the Rothschild dynasty is real. The gap in the account of European financial history's relationship to the commercial networks of the Eastern Steppe is real. These gaps are not necessarily the result of deliberate suppression, although the Rothschild family's careful management of its archival record is a documented fact, but they are the result of historiographical choices about what counts as origin and where the story begins. When you begin the story of modern banking in Florence in the 13th century, you are already starting in the middle. When you begin it in Frankfurt in 1744, you are further in still. The revisionist economic history approach asks that the story begin further back. It asks that the financial networks of the Mongol Empire and its successors be taken seriously as a formative environment for the practices that later appeared in early modern Europe. It asks that the discontinuity between Eastern commercial history and Western financial history be reconsidered as a partial illusion created by geographic and cultural biases in the dominant historiographical map. And it asks that the emergence of the Rothschild dynasty be understood not as a spontaneous flowering of individual genius, but as the moment when a very old set of financial practices became visible at the surface of European history because the conditions of the Napoleonic era created an opportunity for them to operate at a scale that could no longer be concealed. None of this is to say that the family's individual members were not exceptionally capable. Nathan Rothschild was, by any measure, one of the most sophisticated financial minds of the 19th century. His management of British government debt during the wars with Napoleon, his construction of the infrastructure that made London the global center of capital for most of the following 100 years, these are achievements that require intelligence, judgment, and nerve in quantities most people do not possess. The point is not to diminish the individuals. The point is to locate them correctly within a longer story. Mayor Amschel Bauer was born in 1744 in a locked street in Frankfurt. He died in 1812, having laid the foundation for a financial network that would touch every major sovereign debt crisis in Europe for the next century. When he renamed his family Rothschild, he gave them a public name rooted in a local symbol. What he could not give them in a name was the thing that actually made them who they were, the inherited knowledge, the practiced methodology, the network relationships that stretch back through generations before Moses Amschel Bauer, back through the disruptions of the 17th century and the migrations of the 16th, back through the collapse of the Eastern trade system and the fragmentation of the Mongol commercial world, back to the civilization that European cartographers spent 3 centuries mapping under the name of Tartaria, and then stopped mapping without ever quite explaining why they stopped. The red shield above the door is a starting point, the story that it marks, if you are willing to follow it east and follow it back, is considerably older than the sign. The cartographers who drew Tartaria on their maps were recording something they understood to be real. The merchants who traveled its roads were operating within a financial system that they inherited and that they passed on. The families that carried that system westward when the Eastern Order collapsed did not announce themselves. They adopted local names, adapted to local conditions, and continued the practices that had sustained them across the widest empire the world had ever seen. In 1744, one of those families named a child mayor. The child grew up under a red shield in a locked street. He took the shield as his name and sent 5 sons into 5 cities. And the network that had once carried silk and spices across 8 miles of steppe began in a new form to carry something older and more durable than either, the knowledge of how money moves and who it obeys and how to be the one it obeys. That knowledge did not begin in Frankfurt. Frankfurt was where it surfaced. The origin runs deeper than any name, older than any shield, and further east than the borders of any map that the official histories of European finance have ever thought to trace.